And the reason they are, quote, like throwing us off the scent, and when I say us, I mean you and me, I mean people who are actually watching this stuff and have been watching this stuff for years. And also how we are even talking about CBDCs to begin with, which is that we had a financial crisis in 2008, 2009. That's where Bitcoin effectively came to being.
Join us in this eye-opening video as Nomi Prins, the renowned financial expert, uncovers the truth behind inflation numbers, Federal Reserve's ego-driven moves, and the implications for investors. Discover why the Fed's rate hikes might not be as crucial as they seem, and how banks handle their reserve requirements. Unravel the potential of central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, and their impact on the future of money. Gain valuable insights into the global financial landscape and stay ahead in today's ever-changing economic environment.
You know, we don't want a Fed-based currency situation. And the Fed is saying, on the one hand, hey, that's not us. And on the other hand, we got to be in control of it. And Fed now isn't that. But the reality is without Fed now, and this is just the most important thing to take away, without Fed now, we don't have a CBDC. I truly think that if we replace the Fed with a good AI, we would be far more accurate in terms of understanding how information is processed and what's done with it. And we take the sort of ego component out of it. So here's what I think's going on. Speaking of Powell and egos. So obviously we've just seen some good inflation numbers, and that we're basically up 3% over last year, down from 4% over last year in the prior set of numbers. And as you mentioned, the incremental monthly numbers are lower than expected, at just up 0.2% instead of 0.3%. All that is indicative of inflation coming down. Now, the fact that we are even still talking about the Fed, sneaking in another 25 basis points, maybe two other 25 basis points movements upward, is really kind of irrelevant at this point in the scheme of markets, because whatever happens, inflation's going to do what inflation's going to do. An extra 25 basis points here or there is literally not going to change anything. For example, if we have a ratchet up, and it's already and has been still bad in Ukraine relative to Russia, and more, sort of heat in Europe, heat in the United States, we're going to see energy prices pop up. That's just a reality. At that point, inflation is going to pop up again, and there's nothing the Fed can do about that. So basically what I think is if we do have another 25 basis point move at the July FOMC, that is a vanity move. That is an ego move. That's basically the Fed saying, hey, we're not at 2%, which is an arbitrary number anyway, yet. So we're just going to kind of tweak around the edges until we get there. But the reality is, whatever the Fed does at this point, they have paused. They have said they're going to look at the data. We are at numbers from just a year past COVID, and our employment numbers are where they were at before COVID even happened. So this whole hot labor thing is not even really that much of an issue right now. It's just something the Fed is still kind of focused on. But again, I think it's a vanity focus. I think we're at a moment here where we got to understand that the Fed did pause. The Fed did say, even though it wasn't in 100% agreement amongst itself, that we are actually looking at not inflation where we want it to be, but inflation near where we want it to be, and there's still work to do. But they paused. And so any of this incremental noise, any incremental adjustments, which I'm going to call them adjustments, not inflation in fighting rate hikes, that could occur in the next few months if they occur, I don't think investors should be paying attention to them. I think investors should take, at this point, more of that medium and longer term view and say, look, at the end of the day, they're not going to hike rates by 100 basis points. They're not going to dramatically change the cost of money at this point. And the next move, it will be in 2024, not before that, will be a revision downward in rates. And we have to just look ahead at this point. In a way, the Fed's giving itself room, and they're not articulating that to us. But the reality is, if we do have any kind of a prolonged economic slowdown, I'm not saying it's necessarily a recession or something worse than that, but if we do have a slowdown in growth, which we are already seeing. So whether that gets, from a numerical standpoint defined as a recession or not, the point is we are already seeing a slowdown in growth, and that can only potentially continue. And here's why. The debt overhang that all of us have as individuals, we as consumers, we might have stopped buying as much over last month, but we are buying more with debt and with more expensive debt and credit card usage than we have ever had in our history. And that's by the New York Fed's own reports and own numbers. Plus, obviously, as a country, we've just pushed up the debt cap indefinitely for 2 years, and who knows what happens beyond that. So we are basically already relative to inflation, our growth has already slowed down. So I think the Fed is going to have to, as will other central banks, once they get the inflation bug out of their HUDs, will have to turn around and, especially the United States, reduce rates sometime next year. So a couple things. One is the Fed, before the latest set of problems with Signature, with First Republic and so forth, did have a report come out where they said that 722 of the major banks in this country are technically insolvent. So what does that mean? That means that they don't have enough capital to meet deposit runs. We've seen that in a couple of banks, and the banks are still teetering on the edge of that. We still have a situation where what they're paying for deposits isn't enough to make up for where rates are and where else that money can go, including to other banks, online banks, or into other types of investments or money market vehicles. So the banks are still on this tenuous sort of path. And at the same time, the Fed is still sitting on a book of over $8 trillion. At its height, it was just under $9 trillion. They sort of dabbled down a little bit with QT, but they ratcheted that back up again for a minute when we saw those problems emerge with Signature and First Republic and Silicon Valley Bank. So what the Fed is basically saying is, we basically still have over $8 trillion of money on offer to the largest banks in this country, of which most are members. The largest ones have larger memberships of the Fed itself anyway. And they're just saying, hey, we just need a little bit of help here so we don't look as dumb when we have to create money later, which we will if there's a bank crisis. And of course, the banks are saying, look, you gave us all this money. They're not saying it like this, but effectively, you gave us all of this money, and now you're saying you want some of it back. Well, you gave it to us. We don't want to give it back to you. So that's the push-pull that's going on now between the Fed and the banking industry. But make no mistake, the Fed still has a lot of money underlying the banking system that it's not asking for back.
We're still, midway through July here, and we're still anxiously awaiting the launch of Fed Now. How closely will you be monitoring the launch of the Fed Now payment system that the Federal Reserve has cooked up here?
Yeah, so the Fed has been putting into motion this digitalized payment system, which effectively competes with some of the other B2B type payment systems online, whether it's Venmo or Square or sort of the more digital payment systems that people and businesses have available to them to move money more quickly than between banks. That's the Fed's story. That this is all about financial efficiency. The reality is that in order to have a digital currency, we need to digitize the payment systems. What does that mean? The systems between banks and the Federal Reserve. And to be able to access accounts on both and all sides of those equations in a way that is lightning quick and also creates a digital footprint. So without the digital payment system, you don't have the makings of a digital footprint. Without the makings of a digital footprint, you don't have the makings of a digital coin. So this is all about solidifying the technology in order to have a digital coin with all of what that means, with all of the, therefore, analysis of payment behaviors, of the speed of payments, the size of payments, where they're going, and the history of those sets of payments per every single user that utilizes any form of electronic banking system.
It is absolutely the infrastructure needed for one. Then why are they so adamant with statements saying, fine, it's not a central bank digital currency, it's not, but why are they so adamant on saying that we're not interested in one, we're not looking at one, and they've changed their tune a bit, saying maybe we should be involved?
Right.
What are they afraid of?
It's such a good question. They have been really dishonest about the entire backing of the system for a while, and they did put out the Fed recently on its main website a sort of set of Q&A statements about how no, this isn't really a CBDC. No, we're only thinking about it. But if you sort of look back at some of the conversations that have been had in the past before it was more of a reality around the corner that on July 31st. Fed Now is going to become a reality. They were actually much more sort of thinking about it more loudly and more publicly. And the reason for that is they were competing with Bitcoin and they were competing with the crypto world. And they were not saying that, but they're effectively saying, look, we can't not be in control of money. And in order for us to be in control of money, we need to compete on every level that crypto or any other form of money is working in, right? And so that's one of the reasons why they said, yes, we're looking at it. Then they said not. Look, we have a situation, Switzerland, sort of the most secure sort of country in the world in terms of financial transactions of all sorts and types is talking about a CBDC around the corner. We know that other central banks have done it, major central banks, not just El Salvador saying we're going to use Bitcoin, but actually CBDCs that are in the works. The CBDC infrastructure is in the works at the Fed. They have hired programmers. They do have people testing all sorts of the analytical sort of logistics around having a CBDC. And the reason they are, quote, like throwing us off the scent, and when I say us, I mean you and me, I mean people who are actually watching this stuff and have been watching this stuff for years. And also how we are even talking about CBDCs to begin with, which is that we had a financial crisis in 2008, 2009. That's where Bitcoin effectively came to being. You know, we don't want a Fed-based currency situation. And the Fed is saying, on the one hand, hey, that's not us. And on the other hand, we got to be in control of it. And Fed now isn't that. But the reality is without Fed now, and this is just the most important thing to take away, without Fed now, we don't have a CBDC.
So will they be coming for Bitcoin? You say that about viewing Bitcoin as a competition. I mean, we saw the timing of the crackdown on Coinbase of Binance. Do you think that was odd? Do you think that was intentional? And are they coming for Bitcoin?
It's a really good question, because I do believe that some of the platforms have gotten away with a little bit too little transparency, and that could be a problem for legitimate investors and users of Bitcoin and other cryptos. So in terms of cracking down from the standpoint of things going wrong on a regulatory perspective, I think that's going to happen, and I think that actually could make the entire use of Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies more palatable to more people, which makes it more prevalent for more people in the world. But the timing of it and the general sort of stance against Bitcoin, with the exception of Neil Kashkari at the Fed in Minneapolis, is that the Fed doesn't want to be seen as competing with Bitcoin at the same time they are competing with Bitcoin. And this is exactly what's going on. It goes back to control, and not just control of money and money supply and the ability to print money or digitally create money, but it goes to the very heart of what money actually is about nowadays. And it is about a trail of information. And that is something that the Fed knows and is trying to say it's not caring about. But obviously, a digital currency will allow it to capture information. That's just the reality of what it is. So I do think they have been competing with Bitcoin. I do think they don't want to be seen as being competing with Bitcoin. And this is why we hear, and we will continue to hear, both sides of the argument coming from Fed officials.